Hello, I'm Karen Schmidt, board chair of the Botanic Garden at Historic Barnes Park. Behind me is a beautiful labyrinth, which is part of the Judith Grollo Healing Gardens. The Botanic Garden itself sits on the site of the former Traverse City State Hospital farm. And to keep the history of that farm, we repurpose every relic that we find on the site and incorporate them into our gardens. But we also want to save the history of those who came before, the Ottawa, the Chippewa, the Potawatomi. And so we're building a Native American medicine wheel garden, and that garden will be planted with the plants that were traditionally used by the band for health and healing. One of the greatest inspirations for us was the beautiful book, Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Wall Kimmerer. And so when we heard that Dr. Kimmerer and her book are being featured this month by the National Writers Series, we were thrilled. We hope you stop by and watch the construction of the Medicine Wheel Garden. And while you're here, visit the rest of our gardens. There's no admission fee, and the gardens are always open.
Hello and welcome to the National Writers Series. I'm Jillian Manning, the Executive Director here at NWS.
Hi, I'm Liz Kirkwood, Executive Director of FLOW for Love of Water, a Great Lakes Water Law and Policy Center based here in Traverse City. We are so delighted to partner with the National Writers Series tonight. We have been working for the past 10 years with the public to keep our water public and protected. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We're located on lands historically occupied by the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor this ancestral land of the Three Fires Confederacy, the sacred lands and waters of all Indigenous peoples and their continued presence.
And tonight is the perfect night to think about where we have been and where we are going with Dr. Wall Kimmerer, who is the best-selling author of Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year and has touched thousands, probably millions now, of lives across the country and beyond. We're also honored to welcome our guest host tonight, Matthew Fletcher, who is an author himself of The Eagle Returns. He's a FLOW board member, and he's an MSU law professor, a man of many talents. And finally, as we get started tonight, we have two very special presentations for you to start. First will be a blessing from the chairman of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, and second will be a ceremony from the Water Protectors. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and enjoy the evening.
Ani Kanawea, David Arroyo Indigenous Egamawid Endao, Anishna Beck, Gachi Wigwadong, Minwa Inwe Inje Idin Ganzajig, Gamina Inkwesh Gogum Kena Minwa Kindush Dr. Wall Kimmerer. Hello everyone, my name is David Arroyo. I'm the tribal chairman for the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. And on behalf of the Tribal Council and Grand Traverse Band community, we'd like to offer our warm greeting to everyone, and especially to Dr. Kimmerer for this event. I'd like to say miigwech to the National Writer Series. I think it's great that we have this type of event to have everyone come together. So that's a wonderful thing. And also, if I could say real quick that on the 24th, 25th, and 26th of June, I hope that maybe this information could be shared in the chat perhaps, but we are having an online water summit. It's called Zabwi Toda, and that means let's protect the water. Actually, it's Zabwi Toda Nibe. That means let's protect the water. And with that, we can watch a video on water protection. Miigwech.
Bonjour, miigwech. Good to see everyone. Of course, I can't see any of you. My name is Matthew Fletcher. I'm about to begin the conversation with Dr. Kimmerer in a moment. But I wanted to acknowledge the water protectors and the water ceremony we just viewed. Arlene Katasha, Joanne Cook, Eve Batoski, and Melissa Watralak. Anishinaabe Kwe are speaking for us and are working for us, and always have been protecting us. So thank you so much. It's good to be here tonight. It's a great honor to participate in this series at all, and also to be here with Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a great hero of mine. She's the author of a book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which I believe is paradigm shifting. It takes from two separate areas of thought and study and combines them in important ways. For Anishinaabe people, for many Anishinaabe people, these things are sort of obvious how our teachings and the science have always been there. So if you ever see a New York Times article that says, hey, it turns out that smudging with sage actually helps clear a room of bacteria. Wow, think of Anishinaabe people and think of the work of people like Dr. Kimmerer. So it's a great honor to be with her today. And I'm going to begin by reading out something that she said last year. This book was published several years ago now. And it demonstrates what many Indian people have been talking about for the past few years, resilience. It's about a book that could have sort of faded away, but has continued to rise in the bestseller list. And notwithstanding its, the fact that it's about Indians, which is really a remarkable thing. What she told the New York Times I thought was really important, and I wanted to begin our discussion with this these two sentences she said to them. When we're looking at things we cherish falling apart, when inequities and injustices are so apparent, people are looking for another way that we can be living. We need interdependence rather than independence. And Indigenous knowledge has a message of valuing connection, especially to the humble. Dr. Kimmerer, what inspired you to say those words, write those words?
This journey of braiding sweetgrass in the world has connected me to what feels like a deep longing among readers. And it is that longing for just what you're talking about, Matthew, about connection to the living world, the world that sustains us, the world that brings us joy. It just keeps us alive, just that basic. This last year has really heightened our awareness of what is it that really sustains us, right? And I think there's another piece of it. For me, it really resonates with what eco-psychologists have called species loneliness. That when we buy into this mentality that we are, as humans, somehow at the top of this hierarchy and this pyramid of human exceptionalism, that separates us from our relatives. We end up calling them natural resources instead of our more than human relatives. And I think that loneliness is ricocheting through our communities. We're hungry for connection again. And it takes humility, that edbesendoin, right? To know that you're not at the top of the pyramid. We're all in a circle together.
Thank you so much. Congrats for those words. I wanted to start our conversation with talking a little bit about some of the work in the book. And we've mentioned resiliency. We've mentioned this sense of connection. And one of the things that I like to talk to my students about, the people that engage with about Anishinaabe and Indigenous communities, is a sense that there's something that we can teach others. We've gone through sort of an apocalypse, a genocide, and survived it. You start your book early on with a reference to your grandfather, and who is descendant of Potawatomi people who walked on the trail of death. So you're a citizen of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, which is located in Oklahoma. And a lot of people don't know how there are woodlands, Great Lakes Indians who were removed from the Western Great Lakes, forcibly marched. The Potawatomi Trail of Death is a real thing. Happened not long after the Cherokee Trail of Tears, but many people don't really know about that. And that's why there are not just the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, but other nations from the Great Lakes who are located in Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, elsewhere. And what I find fascinating and really heartwarming and hopeful is how those communities survived and adapted. And I love the story of your grandfather and the pecans, and just the image of a boy running through the plains, running through basically a prairie with in his underpants with pants full of nuts. And it's just, I think that story has so many hooks in it. It's the history of Indian people removed from their homelands, but still were able to survive and relearn or learn about a new location and about new plants. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I'm glad you're invoking that, Matthew, for so many reasons. But when you think about being displaced from where you are today in the Great Lakes, so much water, all our fish relatives, the plants, the trees, everyone who was taking care of us, our medicines, right? And literally being walked away at gunpoint to a whole new biome. And the level of heartbreak and loss that accompanied our people in that removal still is just heavy, heavy for me. And I think about what it would be like to go to a place where there was no monoman, where there was no wild rice, where there weren't lakes. And the sense of being displaced, well, not just the sense, the reality of being displaced, it was like going to another planet. And our people survived. That kind of resilience. We survived the catastrophe that was visited upon us. And I think about, how did we do that? By learning from the new land that we were put on, because our people, as Indigenous scientists, we were always scientists, paying attention, seeing patterns, right? And those skills of Indigenous science, when you bring to a whole new ecosystem and habitat, you can say, well, we're going to learn from this land again. And one of the things that of course was learned and shared by the people who were already in Kansas, in Oklahoma, were a lot of the plant foods. And in that book chapter that you're talking about the pecans, I love that story from my grandpa as well, because what a comfort that must have been to have tree food there to help you out, especially in those hungry times when people were newly displaced and asked to lead lives that they couldn't have imagined. So the trees took care of the people, and the people took care of one another as well. And those those lessons of resilience couldn't be more urgent, right, than in this moment of climate emergency. Because essentially what happened, imagine walking from Michigan to, in this case, first Kansas, right? That is climate change only you walked it instead of it coming to you. But if you look at the climate change models, you know what it shows is that the climate of Kansas is walking to Michigan. That it's eerie to look at the symmetry between those two patterns. And so to rely on Indigenous knowledge of adaptation and mitigation comes from just the experience that you've invoked for us, that our people have experienced this before and found the ways to persist, to thrive, and to take care of each other and of the land as well. But I'll also say that heartbreak doesn't end of being displaced from our original homelands. There's great longing for those waters.
Absolutely. Well, I'm turning to another topic. I'm a law professor, and I also serve as a tribal judge for my tribe, Grand Traverse Band, and some other tribes too. And one of the things that, as a law professor, I'm trained in American law, federal law, the law of the state of Michigan and other states where I work. It's a law rooted in Western political philosophies, and it's a bit foreign to us. It has a lot of rough edges to it, and frankly, for me, it was very hard to learn because it didn't seem to have much logic to it. And so when I got out of law school, I was able to study the law of Indigenous peoples as it is applied in some of the farthest corners of the United States. And one or two places and people and thinkers and philosophers that really inspired me included a guy named Keith Basso, who wrote a book that describes perfectly, I think, what Indigenous people think of as the connection between law and their lives, which is wisdom sits in places. And our law comes from where we are located. And Others have a thought, other thinkers, such as Bob Yazzie, who was for many years the Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation Supreme Court, uh, talks about how the law is also embedded in the language. So our territory and our language, the places we come from, places we've been, um, the law is written all around us, and it comes through us in that way. And these are lessons that I feel like I've been thinking about for decades now, but it's such an early stage, I think, in the restoration, the reinvigoration of our law into the 21st century. And your chapter on strawberries reminded me a lot of the work that I tried to do as a tribal judge and as a law professor. Um, you know, the word for strawberry, Anishinaabe Potawatomi, is probably butcher the pronunciation, but Oduman, which is heart. It is a berry in the shape of a heart. And you've already even said the phrase heart berries, which is how we describe that, that fruit, that plant. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the importance and the power of strawberries, of Oduma.
Mm, I'd love to. And it connects for me to your good words about justice and law and what are the laws that we follow and where did those laws come from? And there are ways in which all of the plants are our teachers of natural law. And I would say Oteman certainly is at the heart of that as well. You know, another thing about that word Oteman is the heartberry. That word min, right, is also the root word for gift, which I love about berries and seeds. It's the same word as the root, as what we give. And so I think about the berries as these profound teachers of generosity. And they remind us about the world as gift, not in the Western legal framework of the world as property, right? And object and things to which we claim rights. You know, I think the berries say otherwise. The berries say, no, the world is a gift from berry people and apple people and fish people and grass people. And we know what we do in return for a gift, right? It's instinctive that we go to a place of gratitude, which changes your whole orientation to the world. And then when we've received a gift, we want to give a gift back. And the berries show us that all the time. I mean, we're not the only ones who are picking strawberries, right? All of our bird and four-legged relatives are picking them too. They belong to all of us. We share them, and they teach reciprocity of I give, you take, and then you give back to me. That's the way the world works. It has to work in a circle of reciprocity and responsibility, not of just this linear taking, as if the world was just made of stuff and all that stuff belonged to us.
Fantastic, Miigwech. Um, let's talk a little bit more, jumping off from that notion. We've talked a little bit about, you've talked a little bit about earlier, how many people believe that Earth is here to be under the dominion of human beings. That was certainly what I was taught in school and primarily in church when I would go to church as a kiddo. The story, the origin story of Earth, and the typical telling in a Judeo-Christian religious teaching is that Earth was created in a short period of time, and the most important creature, humans, were created last because they were the most important. And in some creation stories I've heard from indigenous people, including some from Anishinaabe communities, if there was a short period of time in which there was creation, humans did come last, but not because they were the most important. And what I learned, both as a young person learning about this country, learning about, the civics class, and also in church, was that there is a hierarchy. There's a top to bottom, kind of like a pyramid, I suppose. I'll even venture the phrase pyramid scheme, but we'll set that aside for a moment. And at the top are humans, and they're here to exercise dominion. You even see this written in some of the very earliest United States Supreme Court cases about Indian law, in which the Supreme Court refers to Indians not really owning the land because they weren't plowing it all under for purposes of industrialization, mass agriculture, short-term solutions to long-term problems. And it just seemed to a lot of non-Indian people that Indian people weren't really doing much at all with the land. They treaded too lightly, and therefore they must not really have cared that much for the land, which was one of the many justifications for the dispossession of Indian people, their lands and resources. But I want to come back to this notion of hierarchy and talk, I guess maybe turn it over to a little bit of a darker place. In my view, the scariest legendary monster the Anishinaabe could have created is the Windigo. And you have multiple chapters discussing the Windigo. I confess, and this is a little bit of a plug for a project I haven't even yet completed, that I've been working on a graphic novel called Windigo Killers. And my agent and I have been debating what the proper, how this is going to end. How do you kill a Windigo? And so I facetiously told my family today that I was going to talk to the expert, Dr. Kimmerer, about how you kill a Windigo. But more seriously, the thing about the Windigo as a creature of terror for Indian people, and you described this so beautifully in your book, is that it's about scarcity. And it's about the seasonal economy and culture of Anishinaabe people who are from the Great Lakes and further north. It's not just Anishinaabe people who have sort of invented this creature, but is a creature of enormous consumerism. It is always hungry, always eating, and unbelievably powerful. So powerful that it effectively cannot be killed or defeated or there's no real response to a Windigo. And I was really heartened by the underlying philosophy of your book, and most specifically, how you actually describe in some detail how to kill a Windigo, which is incredibly helpful to me. But I would like you to talk a little bit more about the Windigo and where it fits, I think, in your thought process here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so eager to see what you create about Windigo, because if there was ever a being and a force that we need to explore and get to know better again, it's Windigo, right? Because yes, there's the legendary, fearful Windigo that lurks around your villages in the hungry time of the year, right? But we also acknowledge in that sort of duality of Anishinaabeg thinking that's also inside, that we have that compulsion to consume. And it's tied, of course, as a biologist, I have to recognize it's tied to life force as well. You have to consume in order to stay alive. But what it puts in tension is who stays alive. Do we all stay alive by sharing, or does one stay alive and take more than their share and jeopardize everyone else? And it is that tendency toward greed and self-centeredness that we are asked to remember is a monster. And it pains me greatly to live in a society that upholds overconsumption and taking from others, this take, always hungry. I win because I have the most stuff. That's just Windigo, both at the individual level and at a societal level as well. The kinds of social injustices and inequities that we experience are Windigo kinds of thinking. And of course, in the book, I really translate that to the repercussions for the earth when we have Windigo economies. You said the magic word, Matthew, of, it's all about scarcity. And scarcity of not having enough to eat in a UP winter, that's real scarcity, right? That's biological limitations, which we often think we can escape, but we can't. We're subject to them as well. But manufactured scarcity, which comes from the underpinnings of capitalism, is to me more terrible, because it's a kind of scarcity that we create and buy into, rather than thinking back to the strawberries about the world as gift, and that if we engage in reciprocity, we can have abundance, and then the Windigo has no power over us anymore. When we create abundance, the Windigo, he's got no lever on us.
Yeah, that's such these are such important concepts. I see the disputes that Indian tribes and the advocacy of the Indian tribes and Indian people around the country are leading in the United States, challenges to pipelines, challenges to pollution, efforts to protect the water, most certainly here in the Great Lakes, but also anywhere, Oklahoma, Kansas, and the groundwater. Fracking is all over the Great Plains and elsewhere. These are this kind of thing is also the Windigo.
Yes.
The violence that happens in Indian country and against Indian people. We have code words for them, like missing and murdered Indigenous people, men, women, and children. The violence against Black and Indigenous people of color. We have codes for those, but again, it's Windigo. But there's before I wanted to remind before we ask, I have one final sort of big picture question for you. In a few minutes, we're going to open it up for Q&A. So everybody here, the 500 so participants, are encouraged and invited to click the Q&A button and send us a question. Before I ask this last question, I wanted to talk about maple trees next. And I confess that when I read the book, I sort of cherry picked. Once I realized that your book wasn't as linear as many other books are, I felt like I could just cherry pick through the book in some ways, although I will definitely read it from beginning to end again another time. The book about the chapter that struck me that very early on when I picked this book up was the one about citizenship. Again, I'm a law professor, follow Indian law very carefully, and questions of actual literal tribal citizenship are always, are very frequently in front of me as a judge. They are questions I am frequently asked about as someone who is a scholar and commentator on Indian law and policy. But when I opened the book into this chapter about citizenship, it was really a chapter about maple trees, and how kind of like maple trees. The analogy that I drew from it ultimately was sort of like an iceberg. We see a bit of a tip of an iceberg, maybe not literally, more figuratively, than what goes on between maple trees. And there's a lot going on underground, and there's a lot that us humans can't really see without the aid of scientific equipment and with a lot of patience and time to observe these incredible creatures. As you know, and many of us in this meeting know, that Michigan at one time was covered top to bottom in trees like white pine and maple trees. Not that long ago, just a century ago, the Upper Peninsula was still, well, maybe 120, 30 years ago, the Upper Peninsula was still pretty much untouched. But Michigan, the entire state was deforested. There's almost nothing left of the old growth timber. And that's true so many places around the United States. And I thought that your discussion, your linkage between the connection that trees have, maple trees in particular, and citizenship was really very important. And so I wanted to sort of conclude my little 4-question roundtable to you with this sort of hopeful look at citizenship and maple trees. Could you expand on that a little bit, expound on why it is that you draw these connections?
I'd love to. In that chapter, I refer to myself as a citizen of what I think of as Maple Nation. And that when I look around where I live here in upstate New York, sugar maples in Onondaga are probably most numerous citizens. There are more maple trees than there are of us. And when I think about the contributions to our lives here, they're our leading citizens. I try to make the case for the oxygen that they make, for the carbon that they sequester, for the firewood that I burn all winter, for maple syrup, for shade, for habitat, for the medicines that grow underneath them, for the birds that, I mean, they're keystones, right? They are our leading citizens. And it's that back to that pyramid again. We're not up at the top. We are held in this embrace of Maple Nation. And what I have tried to articulate is what feels for me the great wrongness that those maple trees, who are our leading citizens, they are the givers, not just the takers. They have no rights. They can be cut down, deforested in just the ways that you're talking about, because we are embedded in an economy and a worldview that says they're just stuff, that they're just things, not that they're citizens or leaders of the trees. And for me, it brings it honestly back to law, to thinking about how is it in American society that we allow corporations to have personhood, but not trees. Who is it that's really sustaining us? And so the rights of nature movement, which for me really grows out of part of what I think about as part of the indigenous principles of the personhood of all beings, that all beings are due respect and reciprocity. So as you said, to end on a note of optimism, it seems to me that the rise of the rights of nature movement and this when you look in New Zealand, where the sacred Wanganui River under Maori control has legal rights of personhood, right? The Karuk Nation, or was it the Yurok? I forget now. Declared to recognize the rights of the Klamath River as a person, right? So to me, it's very hopeful that people are willing to change their paradigm, and honor all the citizens that with whom we share the planet, not just our own species. It's a matter of interspecies justice, I guess, would be how I'd want to put it.
I might offer a follow-up question, since as I'm sitting here, I find it kind of ironic that we've talked about a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and we haven't really talked about sweetgrass yet. So I think this kind of brings it together. The notion of sweetgrass as one of the 4 sacred plants to Anishinaabe communities and also many other indigenous communities, I think is really important to touch upon. But also the notion of braiding. And when you have a single strand of sweetgrass, it's relatively easily broken, but it's difficult when things are combined, when they are self-reinforcing, like put into a braid. There's that interconnectedness that I would love for you to expound upon a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'm glad to invoke Wingashk, that wonderful plant that is such an important teacher, bringer of kindness and goodness into the world. It's a healing plant. I think of it not only for its spiritual healing, but as a plant ecologist, I know it as a healer of broken land. It's one of those first plants to come in on open ground that has been disturbed in some way, and it begins to braid the soil back together again with its own rhizomes. So it's doing the very work below ground that we in a sense mirror when we braid sweetgrass.
Mm.
And there's lots of teachings about why we braid sweetgrass, and it goes back to our creation story that sweetgrass is the hair of Mother Earth. And we think, well, why do we braid sweetgrass? Well, why do we braid each other's hair? As that sign of love and regard and care for your well-being. And so we braid Mother Earth's hair in the form of sweetgrass as that sign, that kind of tangible sign that we are connected to Mother Earth. And those strands of traditionally of mind, body, and spirit, we are weaving together, braiding together. And in the book, in Braiding Sweetgrass, for me, those three strands also became Indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge in which I'm trained, and most importantly, both of those knowledges, traditional and Western scientific knowledges, are human knowledges. And so for me, that third strand is the intelligence of the living world, of the plants themselves. And that it is all three of those ways of knowing that we can use to show our regard for healing of each other and Mother Earth too.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to, we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A function. So I thought I would read one to you right now and see, look hopeful for your reaction. Here's the question. This is from Edward Smith. I enjoyed reading about the morning ritual of her father tipping his coffee cup, pouring some onto the ground before he sipped his morning coffee. What does this say about Native citizen values about Mother Earth?
Nice question. Thank you for that. Brings me back to thinking about my dad doing that. And, he's 91 and he's still doing it. It's the impulse for reciprocity and gratitude, isn't it? It's the impulse of saying, can you believe the good fortune we have to have another day to be alive on this beautiful planet? What is our only possible response but gratitude, and to share the gift that we have? And the notion of Thanksgiving, which in conventional United States society we celebrate once a year, right? But the idea of daily Thanksgiving, gratitude really brings you to a different place in the world. It helps you recognize your interdependence, not your independence. And I was reading that people who practice gratitude consume less than people who don't. And that makes sense to me. And so when you think about how climate change and biodiversity loss and so many other forms of injustices are driven by our consumption, they're driven by that Windigo inside of us, that gratitude can be medicine for that consumption. It's powerful in a lot of ways.
Thank you so much. I have a question. I might rephrase it just slightly, because I think we started talking about this earlier. But the premise of the question is that European cultures were indigenous once as well. How can people so many generations and miles and oceans removed from those indigenous origins get back in touch with those ideas and values?
I love this question, because it is also the antidote to the unfortunate nature of cultural appropriation, of saying that I want to feel this reverence and reciprocity with the living world too, so I'm going to borrow it from others. To me, it's a matter of finding it, your own authentic relationship with place. And it might come from the traditions and ways of being of your ancestors in another place. It might well be there. And that is a worthy journey to explore. But I think it's also inside every one of us. The most authentic relationship to place is when you recognize the citizenship of the beings who are around you, when you recognize the world as gift, and then you say, well, in return for this gift of this water, these birds, this forest, this food, what is the gift that I will give in return? What's my responsibility that's coupled to that gift? That's when you become native to place, is when you're engaged in reciprocity. If you're just taking all the time, that's colonizer mentality. But to become a naturalized citizen, the way, and I mean that in the way that botanists talk about naturalized species who came from someplace else, but have come to fit in to our natural flora because they have important roles. They're in reciprocity with the local ecosystem. So we call them naturalized. And I think that is the authentic way to be at home, to engage in reciprocity with your place. And that, to me, is what makes a home.
Thank you. I'm going to try to consolidate a few questions, and there's a theme from several questioners, which is about how to talk to children about this, how to engage with children with some of the ideas that you have in your book. Obviously, it's a book for adults. It's pretty accessible. I'm going to try to get my teenage boys to read it, but how would you assist teachers in engaging children with the ideas that you have in Braiding Sweetgrass?
Yeah. First of all, let me say I am working on a children's book after so many folks saying, "Oh, we need this as a children's book." So it's hard, but I am working on that. But what I would say from this to this questioner, who is clearly attentive to kids and to teaching, is that, in many cases, it's not what we have to teach kids, it's what we have to not teach them. Kids come with biophilia, this innate love and curiosity for the living world. Kids don't call butterflies and birds they don't think about them as object, right? I think about wandering around with my own kids and now my own grandkids. They're saying, well, he does this, or look, she's eating the flowers. They know the personhood. They know relationship with the living world. But what do we do when our toddler says, oh, she's climbing the tree? We say, oh, no, that caterpillar isn't it. It is climbing the tree. That is a powerful reframing, which is present in the language that we use. It's saying the world is object. The world is not your relative. The world is not a person. So not teaching our children that and encouraging their natural tendencies to be in relationship with the living world is I think our foremost task. And thinking about itting the world, I've been actually working with inspired by our Anishinaabe languages, which, as you know, we can't it strawberries or lakes or maple trees. We speak of them with the same grammar that you and I, Matthew, would speak about with one another. We have the grammar of animacy, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about how English could have an intervention and get rid of itting the world, and use different language for the living world. And I think that starts with kids.
I love that idea. That's fantastic. I'm going to move on to another question, and I'll read this out loud. It's from Stephanie Light. Sorry if I mispronounced that name. She says, I love the passage in your book about the Indigenous elder who says, quote, this sustainable development sounds to me like they just want to be able to keep on taking like they always have, end quote. I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on the current discourse on sustainable development. How do you feel about sustainability becoming more common in Western mainstream mainstream Western culture, and how is sustainability different from sustainable development?
Mhm.
A lot there.
Yeah, there sure is. I guess one of the things that I would want to respond to is that, first of all, how do I feel about the movement towards sustainability? Well, compared to the movement that said it doesn't matter what we do, the movement towards sustainability is is positive, right? The fact that we are trying to live in such a way that we don't damage the capacity of the earth is hugely important. But as I say in that chapter, I think we're going about it in only half of the proper way. It's not just about how can we engineer things so that we can keep satisfying our needs. Back to Windigo, it's saying, how could we give? How could we give back? It really asks for regenerative economies rather than extractive economies. And so I think that notion of reciprocity and regeneration is what really needs to move the needle on sustainability, because then it also becomes your responsibility to be in reciprocity with the gifts that you are given. I guess the last thing I would want to say about that, without getting too much into the weeds on sustainable development, is that the phrase that I like to use is mutually sustaining, not just sustainable, but mutually sustaining, in that, again, it invokes this idea of reciprocity, that we're all responsible for each other, that all flourishing is mutual, and it's a verb. It's something that we have to live and do. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to read another question from Shelley, who is on unceded Anishinaabe and Wyandot lands. She says, I found the chapter on allegiance to gratitude particularly moving. Please speak on the process of making the bill of responsibilities.
Yeah. That wonderful quote from my dear friend, the late Chief Irving Powless, who would say, "Yep, the colonists, they built their government based on Haudenosaunee principles that came from the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy." And he said they just made that mistake, though, of writing the Bill of Rights rather than the Bill of Responsibilities. And all I can say is yes. Exactly. And that's part of the transition to regenerative economies, regenerative societies, is when we realize that gifts come with responsibilities. And oftentimes, we think about those responsibilities as somehow onerous, but it can also be really joyful to be in right relationship with the living world. Maybe it's just me, because I pay attention so closely to the living beings around me, but what it feels like when humans walk through the world, we have to kind of hang our heads in a sort of ashamed way because of the way we've treated our relatives. That is a burden. That is a burden that we all carry, whether we acknowledge it or not. And set the Thanksgiving address and living in gratitude and reciprocity enables us to imagine walking through the world with your head held high, and know that you have been involved in the joy of taking care of your relatives. That feels good.
Agreed. This next question reminds me of a story that I've heard many times over the last several decades about Nanabuju, and I think it comes mostly out of the Red Lake Nation of Ojibwe up there, where the land was never ceded or parceled out, and many of the trees remain there. And story of Nana Buju is how Nana Buju fought Paul Bunyan and ultimately knocked him out with a giant walleye. And that's the reason why there are still trees in parts of northern Minnesota. But the question is from Jana Harper. I love the chapter in your book about Nana Buju and being indigenous to place. Could you please talk about the energy of Nana Buju, about how the energy of Nana Buju works in relation to that of Windigo?
What an interesting question. And what a beautiful story about the fish and the trees. I want to know more. Of how does Nana Buju energy work with Windigo energy? I've not thought so much about that in those terms, but I think my immediate response would be that there's a way in which they mirror the energies of creation and destruction, which are both present and at work in the world. Sometimes in Western storytelling, there's good and evil, right? The good and evil twins, etc. But those two are really, creation and destruction are not good or evil forces. They just are. They are present in the world and constantly in balance, in tension for balance between them. And so I think that's how I look at that, is that when we talk about Manoba Martwin, we're talking about living in balance, and part of that balance is between the forces of creation and destruction, which might be understood in terms of those two figures, those two ideas, if you will.
I think that's right. There are a series of questions that sort of have a theme to them, which is, I will confess I'm a little uncomfortable with, but I think we've talked about this already. And the theme basically is of difference between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And this is the part that I'm sort of uncomfortable with. And what the questions are really asking is, how do I as a non-Indigenous person help? Or which organizations can I reach out to try to assist? How do I approach tribes, particularly here in Michigan, Anishinaabe tribes, about I'm not sure what. And so I'm not trying to impugn at all or critique anyone for these really important questions. And I'm often asked these questions myself. But I have not really a set answer, but I have sort of pat answers that I use. And I wonder if I'm sort of shortchanging the questioners when I answer the way I do. And I'm curious how you would respond. And so these questions are sort of, how do non-Indian people reach out to Indian people to help?
Yeah. The question of how do you become a good ally is a really important one. And I think that's an important framing of it, is to be an ally. And gosh, there's so many elements of that depending on where your starting place is. But one of my standard responses to that is respect for sovereignty. For political sovereignty, for intellectual sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, to really have cultural respect, and to uphold them in all of the ways of citizens. We have to remember that when we think about sovereignty and we think about government, for example, we often hear people talk about Indian treaties, right? As if those were treaties that bound the behavior of Indigenous peoples. No, a treaty is between two sovereign entities, right? So that means that the settlers have just as much responsibility to that treaty as Native people do. So recognizing your responsibility as essentially a treaty signer yourself is important. Know what the treaties are in the lands that you live in, and uphold those. There's, I'm thinking in my mind of, we here in Haudenosaunee territory a few years ago, Haudenosaunee Nation members, as well as citizens of Central New York State, worked together to create this poster called "How to Be a Good Ally," and it has so many good thoughts on it. But one of the ones that I especially want to emphasize, in addition to systemic things like sovereignty and treaty rights, is be a good neighbor. Just be a good neighbor, as a way of being a good ally, of knowing one another as human people, absolutely respecting differences. But we know how to be good neighbors, and so let's do that.
Well, we've reached the end of our time, but there's one last question I think that would be a great way to end. In part because this is the National Writers Series, and where it's the beginning of this season, you're the opening, sort of, to draw from a baseball analogy. I love baseball. You're the leadoff batter. So Sophie Blanchard asks, are there other writers or poets that you draw inspiration from? I love that question, so I'm going to ask it of you.
Oh, gosh, yes. Where do I begin? Well, I will begin with poets. I must have been a weird teenager. Yeah, well, I was. From my youth, I have drawn inspiration from Walt Whitman. Whitman is, for me, a really grounding poet of democracy, of humanity, of the earth. So that's where my poetry roots lie, if you will. But I would say most recently, Richard Powers. I just love his work that is so grounded in science, but the deep, rich human questions that arise around it, social questions, cultural questions. So I really love his writing. Most recently, of course, the Overstory, about trees and citizenship, and so many of the things that we've been talking about. Among Anishinaabe writers, I am an unabashed Louise Erdrich fan. I just wait for the new book. I have recently been reading also Richard Wagamese, and finding a lot of inspiration. I'm reading now his volume called Embers, and finding much to contemplate there.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I believe that we've sort of reached the end of our time, and I hope one of these days that you and I can actually meet and connect in person.
I hope so too.
And yeah, I think this was a lot of fun for me, and I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you for the good conversation.
Thank you, Miigwech. We're going to conclude tonight with a drum performance from an Anishinaabe drum group. And thank you all for coming. Please stick around.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please remember to purchase a copy of Braiding Sweetgrass from your local independent bookstore. And thank you to everybody who made this event possible tonight. First, our grantors, the Michigan Humanities, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, our sponsors, Grand Traverse Regional Community Foundation, our presenting partner, Flow, and our community partners, the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, and the Botanic Garden at Historic Barnes Park. Thank you as well to all of you viewers for tuning in tonight, and we are so excited to welcome you again on June 24th when we talk with Emily Henry about her book, People We Meet on Vacation. We'll see you then. Have a great evening.